My name is Hilary Morrissey, and I wanted to know what the attitudes of the other TPP countries were. Are they pro or anti? What's the general, is Japan likely to pass, for example?
There's varying degree of protests in different countries. Japan's an interesting one because they're the other one that it will fall down if they don't end up agreeing. There's been a big protest movement against the TPP in Japan, which also involves farmers because for them it involves quite big changes to agriculture and reductions in tariffs, particularly for farm goods in Japan, but they're also concerned about things like this investor right to sue governments, medicines issues, and the other issues that we're concerned about. So there's been a big movement of consumer groups, unions and farmers, and also internet activists in relation to the copyright stuff. So what's happening is that it was going to be considered by the Japanese Parliament in June, but partly because of the earthquake and also because it was postponed. Now what's happening in July in Japan is that there's a Senate election. The upper house is having an election. And so the protest movement there is trying to make it a big issue in the upper house elections and trying to improve the numbers against the TPP in the upper house. Their Liberal Democratic Party, which is the governing party, is actually a bit split over the TPP because they have a lot of farmers who support them. So I think that it's our friends there say it's likely to go through, but it's going to be, a lot will depend on what happens in this Senate election, basically. And there has been a big protest movement there about it. There's also a legal process underway where they're saying that there's a challenge on saying that the TPP is inconsistent with the Constitution of Japan, but these things tend to not move very fast. In other countries where there are sort of democracies and oppositions, there's a couple of countries in the TPP group where that's not the case, but in countries like Canada, Mexico, Peru and Chile, there have been movements against the TPP, but it's difficult to say whether they'll get majorities in parliaments to vote against the implementing legislation. It was an issue in the Canadian election, and it was the previous Conservative government lost the election. The new Liberal government with rockstar Trudeau has been critical of the TPP, and they've been holding this long public hearing process, but whether they'll actually vote against it in the end, it's a bit like the Labor Party here. It'll take a lot of public pressure to get them to vote against it. However, they've also got a very controversial agreement with going through with the Europeans, and so that might influence the outcome of the TPP too, because there's been a lot of protest against that. New Zealand, where there's been a huge protest movement, which some of you would have seen reported, they're still going through the parliamentary process as well. Unfortunately, they don't have an upper house, and the government has the numbers in the lower house, but they're going to make a huge fight to the end, which will be, there'll be a few more months of the parliamentary process.
I'll just make a quick point about some of the engagement. One of the things that PSI did working with AFTERNET was to get nurses unions within the TPP country to sign on to letters to their governments. One of the difficulties with a lot of the Asian countries in our region is that public sector unions are not allowed. You're not allowed to have a union if you're a public sector worker, so there's a fair bit of muting going on there. But I'd also like to point out that with regard to the Trading Services Agreement, the civil rights movement, the civil society organisation movement in Uruguay got the government to pull out of the TISA agreement very effectively. So I guess the point there to draw out is the importance of trade union rights in any of these fights against free trade agreements.
I'm fascinated by the scepticism that various legislatures have over the TPP, obviously particularly by the attitude of the Australian Senate. And I just wonder what would happen if, aside of course from the possibility that they may refuse to pass the enabling legislation altogether, in which case we're just not part of it. If, say, a rider was added saying that, for example, legal disputes can only be brought before Australian courts, and that any decision of the ISDS was null, void and of no effect.
Well, this is part of the undemocratic process. Because ISDS is in the text and doesn't require any implementing legislation, our Parliament can't do that. I mean, it could pass a resolution saying that, but it would have no effect, because the legally binding document says that there will be this investor-state dispute process and sets out all the processes, and our government has signed it. So the only way you can stop it is to not pass the implementing legislation, the other implementing legislation, which does have to go through the Parliament. And that's things like the tariffs changes and some other, there's actually minimal levels of legislation that have to be passed in Australia. But so it's mainly tariff changes. And so the only way the Parliament can stop it is to vote against them and vote against the whole agreement.
And at any rate, I think it's almost a nonsense to imagine it, because the intent of these free trade agreements is to undermine sovereign ability to determine how your economy should run in the interests of the capitalist class. It's going to occur no matter what, whether it's through the TPP or the RCEP or whatever else.
The US Constitution gives treaty-making power to the Congress.
Yes.
Whereas in our Constitution, it's with the Governor-General and Council, so it's a cabinet. So that's a difference. And with the fast track in the US, the Congress agrees it'll only vote yes or no to the whole thing. But afterwards, they do get a second shot at it after all as well. But it's a difference in the constitutions.
About the general political context we have at the moment in the world, we have a split between, a right-wing populist reaction to globalisation, to capitalist globalisation, shown by Donald Trump and, in my opinion, the Brexit. And we also have a left-wing and progressive response to globalisation shown by the Bernie Sanders campaign, for example, and probably Jeremy Corbyn, and, well, we can argue what's happening in the Australian election about that, but so it is an interesting speculation to say, I mean, I wonder if the speakers could comment, in the United States you've got actually two sides of the argument against the free trade agreement and all free trade agreements, and of course a big issue in the US is NAFTA, and the major argument against the TPP is the experience of NAFTA. So I just wondered, I mean, it seems to me that it actually in one way strengthens the fact that the TPP may go down, because if the pressure is going to be definitely on Clinton from the Sanders supporters and from all over, from the trade unions and everything in the United States to bring it down, and on the other hand Donald Trump's come out against it. I mean, I suppose my question is it possible for a government to change their mind and withdraw? Like, to me, if that Congress was to pass it in December, following the election and the new Congress coming in, either side is probably going to be massive pressure from the whole US population, whether right or left, to actually dump it. So, I think in one way or another we can see that there's a massive tide of dissatisfaction and opposition to the corporate globalisation, and some of it's coming from a racist point of view or that sort of attitude, and another one is from a progressive point of view. So, yeah, I just wonder if you could comment on that.
When you look at how Sanders has responded to the TPP, you could imagine that his analysis and his response is based in an understanding and an analysis of what's good for society and what's good for people. Whereas Trump, I think, is just responding to populism. I don't think Trump has an analysis about seeing the TPP as being bad for society as a whole, given where he's losing his father's wealth from. The reason Trump is able to engage, and the reason why Trump is engaging around the TPP, is because there's a bit of a void in the American politics that's actually allowing those workers to have a natural voice within their government under the Democrats there. Very much the same, some would argue, is being replicated, whether it's in European nations or indeed here in Australia. So it's too easy, I think, to talk about whether it's coming from the left or coming from the right. The right's coming simply because of popularism, and it's allowing them an audience, and the response therefore is completely different. I think what's important from that is that it should point to, for us, the way to mobilise people, the way to tap in and the way to fill that void before the right does here in Australia, tapping into that disengagement of the workers who've been disadvantaged because of trade agreements.
I do think that the reaction to both neoliberalism and globalisation is coming from both the right and the left, and I think the right reaction is very dangerous, because what Trump and the Nigel Lafarge is his name? Farage have done is whip up racism and xenophobia and those sorts of reactions. History tells us that when large parts of the population have falling living standards and are alienated from the political process, you do get the growth of fascism. I mean, that's what happened before World War II. So I do think that that's all the more reason for us to be explaining these things from a progressive political point of view and from a left point of view, and as Michael said, putting forward a positive vision about what, not just how we can have better trade agreements, because we do have to trade with people, but it should be on the basis of human rights and environmental protection and so on, but also more generally campaigning against the whole neoliberal paradigm, which he mentioned in his talk as well.
What about, can a government dump it?
Ah, right, yes. That's an interesting question. The question was, if the lame duck Congress passes the implementing legislation in November, could the incoming Congress in January then reverse that decision? And I don't know enough about the US Constitution. I would think that they could, theoretically, but there would be an enormous pressure on them not to.
This question might perhaps be a little bit non sequitur about the only causal link between this and the topic of the TPP is that clearly the main beneficiary of the TPP does seem to be multinational corporations. The question I would seek to ask is that, considering that any changes to tax regimes, in fact any changes to legislation generally, we generally have to be informed about it so that we have the opportunity to debate it, discuss what amendments we might want to do to it, and so forth. The problem is multinational corporations will use such information to arrange their affairs so as to avoid, from their perspective, the worst effects of such legislation. The mining tax perhaps might well be considered an example of this. those companies that knew that this legislation was coming in would have had the opportunity to arrange their affairs so as to avoid tax liability. How do we do this balancing act between allowing us all the right to debate any proposed legislation, whilst at the same time not giving multinational corporations the ability to arrange their affairs so as to avoid the consequences the legislation might have on their tax liabilities and perhaps their liabilities in so many other areas?
I'm not sure there's a way of doing that, actually, because my history of working in this area is always to push for more transparency from government, particularly around trade agreements. I mean, we want to see the text while they're negotiating them. We know that what happens with multinational corporations with trade agreements is that they generally do get to see the text. In fact, they write some of it, although that's not generally admitted. But there's very close consultation with them. So I don't think that we can kind of say the answer to that is less transparency. The answer to that is to have people's movements to reject the sort of proposals that multinational corporations put through, and to try and get much tighter regulation so they can't have the tax loopholes and the tax havens that they do have. And both Michael and I have been involved in specific campaigns against, for better forms of taxation and against tax havens and so on, as part of the broader campaign about how to fund public services. So I do think you have to, on our side of politics, you have to support transparency, but you have to support more regulation, not less, of corporations so that they can't find these loopholes and so on and influence governments to use them.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name's Kieran Howard from the Politics and the Pub Committee. I've got two questions, a brief preamble to begin with. In warning about the dangers of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the American economist Joseph Stiglitz says, quote, "We know we are going to need regulations to restrict the emissions of carbon, but under the Investor-State Dispute Settlement, ISDS provisions, governments in the TPP can be sued by the corporations for the loss of profits resulting from any regulations that restrict corporations' ability to emit the carbon emissions that lead to global warming." So my question is, how does the TPP, if it goes ahead, how does that conflict with our international obligations to save the planet and perhaps other international agreements that we've signed up to, like human rights, for instance? My second question, in barracking for the TPP, President Obama warns, quote, "If we don't write the rules, China will write the rules." My question, is the TPP therefore a continuation of geopolitics by other means, the economic component of America's pivot to Asia, the economic component of the ongoing rivalry, potential conflict between America and China?
Okay, so on the regulation of carbon emissions, this is a danger. The TPP claims to have exceptions in it for, or protections against corporations suing governments over environmental legislation, but those protections are very weak and they haven't stopped previous environmental cases like the two I mentioned against Canada on gas mining, and when the US, well, the one against the US from a Canadian company when the US decided against a pipeline for environmental reasons, the construction of a pipeline which was going to carry oil from shale oil from Canada to the US. There hasn't yet been a specific case against emissions regulation, but there could be. So that's a danger. And that's why a lot of environmental organisations are really concerned about the TPP. because it could be, ISDS could be used against any type of environmental regulation, despite the so-called safeguards. Secondly, the US-China rivalry. Yes, I did have this to mention in my speech. I usually mention it, but I ran out of time. But it's very much, it's been in the picture from the beginning. It is part of the US pivot to Asia, and the US has said from the beginning that, and if you look at who's in the TPP, it's more than half of the countries are those which already have free trade agreements with the US. So it's a kind of coalition of the willing of North and South American countries plus some selected Asia Pacific countries to get a wedge into more influence for the US in Asia. And it's interesting that since the US official economic study of the TPP was done by the US for the US Congress, that showed that there were, again, minuscule benefits actually for the US after 15 years from the TPP. They've really emphasised that strategic component. Obama's been saying a lot, you know, we have to have the TPP because we write the rules instead of China. It is a product of that sort of rivalry. Unfortunately, Michael mentioned this other agreement which China is part of, the RCEP, which is more of an Asian regional trade agreement. The rules that China would write would be different from the US, but some of them would still be very much in the interests of Chinese global corporations. So they don't have a big pharmaceutical industry, but they do have now global corporations that are investing in mining, for example. So China has started to agree to having ISDS in its trade agreements. So from our point of view, we have to be wary of either major power in terms of their sort of goals and motives for trade agreements. But I do think that the TPP is a much more comprehensive program for corporate rights at the moment, and it's the one we have to defeat first. The RCEP is still in the process of being negotiated, and because it's got the ASEAN countries in it and India in it, it's going to be much more difficult for them to, well, they only have 10 chapters instead of 30, and they're going to face more roadblocks from some of those countries who have different interests. Like as I said, there won't be a big push on medicines because both China and India have huge generic medicines industries, and they don't want to put roadblocks in the way of generic medicines, for example. So there's different interests there. And but the TPP, with its 30 chapters which tie the hands of governments from future regulation, is the biggest danger at the moment, I think.
I think what Joseph Stiglitz was hitting on there is the very crux of what these free trade agreements are about. We have civil society organisations, the scientific and lived facts of climate change on the one hand, pushing for changes from our governments and changes for a better world, and on the other hand we have the free trade agreements that are undermining those very acts. And in fact, it's something that Public Services International has been drawing attention to with regard to the Trade in Services Agreement and in fact the TPP, the contrast between the negotiations that were going on in France with the action on climate change versus the negotiations that were going on in Geneva with the Trade in Services Agreement. It is the corporations' way of getting their way no matter what else happens, and it's why we've got to say no to the free trade agreements.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you to thank our speakers, because they'll be winding up the Q&A. Thank you very, very much.
No TPP! No TPP!